don't fall in love with the deal. You've got to look at it from an investment standpoint.
Welcome to the Insurance Refocused podcast, where we're highlighting real agent stories and how they are innovating to respond to the changes and challenges happening in the independent insurance industry. My name's Lindsay, and I can't wait to introduce you to my amazing co-host, who just so happens to be my mom, Carey Wallace. Mom, how you doing today?
I'm having a good day, Lindsay. How's your day going?
Doing good. Super pumped for this conversation. Short intro as we jump right in. We're going to have a super awesome conversation about M&A, but before we even get into it, want to thank Bradley, who's our guest today, for one, just inspiring us to start this podcast and also giving us the framework and rails in order to do it appropriately. I don't think the Insurance Refocused podcast would be here or where we are today without you. Really appreciate all that you did for us in supporting it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm humbled to finally get the invite.
I know it's kind of weird. Like, how in the world did we get through a whole year and not interview you? Like, that's the craziest thing. But I'm super pumped that you're here with us today, Bradley. I got to tell you. So, I don't know about that. I don't know, but I know that you and I have had a lot of conversations about M&A. That's probably the understatement of this podcast, right? So. I think it was super fitting last year when I don't know if you texted me, if somebody else texted me. I can't really remember when I saw your picture on the cover of the IA magazine in relationship to an M&A article that you were interviewed for. Like, nothing could be more fitting than 2023. Because if I were going to pick the headline for Bradley Flowers for 2023, maybe the first part of the year anyway.
Yeah, well, it was funny. They reached out, and it was that was probably one of the coolest things that's happened to me is being on the cover on that magazine. And they actually told me I was going to be on the cover on my birthday, so that was a nice birthday present. But I was just a part of an article about M&A, and I guess I was the most attractive one. That's why they put me on. I don't know, I'm joking. But I'd done two small acquisitions really early. I did one on the captive side, one on the independent side right after we opened Portal. And I hadn't done one at the time of that interview. But I looked at like 50 deals. So I had the knowledge about it, just hadn't done one. And I felt a little bit, I was getting a little bit of imposter syndrome being on the cover, having not done one. And then literally like the day after the cover dropped, the one that we bought in January went under LOI. So I was like, man, if they would have just.
Yeah. It was pretty cool, but though it was kind of fitting though by the time the magazine came out. Like that was the body of work that had taken a lot of your time. So I guess with this interview, I would love to start at the beginning and talk about I'd love to talk about the journey through that and not just the day after. I do want to spend some time about what it's been like since post acquisition. But if you wouldn't mind, start about how did you even go about finding the right acquisition for you? You said we looked at a ton, and what process you.
Yeah, I think it's the answer that everybody hates, whether it's where do you find new business, where do you meet your wife, where do you whatever, it's relationships. That's the answer everybody hates because it's not easy. There's several websites that I've sourced deals from that we've looked at. Cake being one, Agency Equity being another one. Sometimes those can be, and I've worked with brokers too, which are mostly like awful, but the because the people are overpromised on their multiple they're going to be getting, and that's the biggest challenge I think in the ones that didn't fall through. And I had an acquisition in 2022 that you probably remember that made it till the day before closing, and the seller pulled out for reasons unrelated to me, reasons that I completely understood. Um, but that's been the big theme is I think people like having unrealistic expectations with what they're going to get for their agency. And you have to decide in that moment, okay, am I going to be the jerk that tells them this? Or am I going to wait till somebody else does and hope they come back to me? You know, but the, my thing is like, I always look at people that are more successful than me and say, okay, what's my version of what they're doing? Like life and business is easy. Just talk to and emulate people that have done what you're trying to do and put your spin on it. And so like our agency is really, really good at growing organically, organic sales, organic growth, up until January of this year, 100% of the premium, well, all of the premium, but $500,000 of it was growing completely organically through outbound marketing and inbound marketing and that sort of thing. So we're really good at that. A lot of the larger agencies, in my opinion, grow by what I call osmosis. They get so big that they just grow because they have so much business. And the way that they get big is through acquisitions. Like, I mean, you look at the largest agencies in the country, the Acrisures, the PCFs, the Hubs, they all grow by M&A, and may or may not be really good at actual organic growth. And so our thing is okay, let's do both. Let's copy what they're doing and buy some agencies. I mean, with the podcast we have and the network, I would be remiss if we didn't try to do that. And then B, still grow organically. And like, I mean, it's worked this year. With the acquisition, not only do we have more opportunities for more sales because we have more customers and more potential customers, but also we increased the size of our sales team by 3 people. And, we exceeded our 2023 goals in May of this year, just with those 2 things. So I guess that sort of answers your question.
So let's talk about this though. We probably looked at how many. Well, I was brought in on maybe 25-ish, maybe
Yeah,
25-ish. But you looked at how many before you got there?
at least 50, at least.
Yeah.
And
so
I got
I think
pretty good
that's
at
key.
recognizing it. Yeah, yeah. And I got pretty good at recognizing like what was a deal and what was not. And now you and I have worked together so much that I really only have to bring you in when we're getting ready to like make make an offer and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm a numbers guy. I don't have a degree, let alone an accounting degree or finance degree, anything like that. But I've gotten pretty good at reading a P&L, providing the P&Ls are accurate. And I know now that we've done one, and we can get into a little bit. I think the one that we did was probably the hardest one we'll ever do. It's just now that we've been down that road, I think it's going to make it easier in the future.
No doubt. So I think number one, if someone's listening to this and they've never acquired before, don't think the first thing that comes across your desk is the one you're going to buy. It doesn't
No.
necessarily work like that. And I think a lot of people get disappointed that they have an opportunity and for whatever reason it doesn't work. Like, you got to be okay with a lot of no's. You're saying no and the other person saying no in order to make this happen, right?
Well,
So
I tell agents, don't fall in love with the deal. You've got to look at it from an investment standpoint. Don't get emotionally attached to it, because if you get emotionally attached to it, you're going to be thinking with your heart, not your head. I had an agency owner that's probably listening to this. It's a good friend of mine that I told him that. And the next day it fell through and he called me all sad. And he's like, I didn't listen to you. Now I'm pissed off. I'm like, you gotta be willing to just walk away. And when you're willing, it's like going to a car dealership to buy a car. If you're willing to walk away, you're going to get a better deal than if you go in there falling in love with the Corvette or whatever. But I didn't answer your original question. So how I found this one, I went on a carrier trip. There's only two reasons I go on carrier trips, and I go to Big I functions: to recruit and find agencies to buy. That's it. That's why I'm there. That's why I don't send my people to Big I events, because I don't want other people who are doing the same thing to get them. And I was on a carrier trip, and me and a few agents were smoking a cigar by the fire pit. And this guy that I sort of knew, he was a business acquaintance, mentioned that somebody had offered him, I don't remember what the number was, but it was a reasonable number. I think I'm not going to say the number, but it was exactly what I paid for it. And he said, I got an offer by XYZ company to buy my agency for X. And I said, I'll pay that for it. That was in November of 22. And in August of 23, he reached out. So it was just that simple. You know what I mean?
100%.
Yeah.
I think the piece you were talking about before, though, the keeping your attitude about it in check, is super, super hard throughout the due diligence, like the whole due diligence process. How do you constantly remind yourself of that? Or is it just a mindset that you go into every single sale, like you've trained yourself because you've done it quite a few times now?
I'm gonna make a golf analogy, which is perfect since this is an insurance podcast. Like, the reason professional golfers don't really get nervous over a shot is because they've done it 1,000 times. The reason, I'm sure, Carey, you remember when Lindsay got her driver's license and started driving, and you were super nervous for her getting on the road. You're probably still nervous, but less nervous now when she's like making a road trip because she's done it 1,000 times. I think it's just looking at it 1,000 times and going through the process. You're willing to say, hey, there's not a deal here. Carey and I looked at a deal recently that was a large agency that on paper, the multiple they were asking for was really good, but when you dug into it, it was not. And it's just like this agency had many locations. So we would have flipped the script and Portal would have had 20 plus locations overnight. It would have been a splash acquisition, but it didn't make sense. So we walked away from it. That's not to say I don't get a little annoyed sometimes, but I had one guy I was texting with 2 weeks ago, and I was like, I went through his P&L and I was like, okay, da 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 da, and I basically like explained to him what it was worth. And he's like, well, I've got many more people in my DMs. And I was like, great, I just did in 10 minutes what it's going to take them 3 weeks to tell you this is what they're going to pay for it.
And it's not wrong.
Call me later,
Yeah. Yeah. So let's just, for people that are listening and they're setting expectations, number one, it's probably not going to be the first acquisition that comes across your table. But number two, time-wise, getting through due diligence, getting through lending, getting to an actual deal. Tell me from your perspective what it took to get there and what people should expect in that process.
Okay.
I know it's loaded, loaded.
Let me explain how I changed my strategy a little bit first, and because it kind of dovetails into that. So I lost a few deals because I was slow pre-LOI because I wanted to get the perfect offer. And I started observing some of the large agencies, and a lot of them go to LOI as fast as possible so they can lock the seller up. And then they do all of their due diligence and stuff. Whereas I was trying to do the due diligence really on the front end. And as long as you have an out in that LOI, you're good. It's not like my wife and I just put an offer in on a rental house and we had to put $5,000 earnest money. There's really not, correct me if I'm wrong, Carey, there's not a situation like that with an agency. So I changed my strategy up. Now I get the financials. I try to get to a reasonable number as fast as possible and send that to them. And I've had many more deals that went a little bit further because of that than trying to craft the perfect offer. But for this one, we went under LOI like August 22nd of 23. And I back to my original point, I reached out to someone that Carrie and I know really well at a large agency, and he literally sent me their due diligence list of what they do, and we took it and made it our own. The very first thing I did, other than securing financing, if you want to talk about that, we can. But we notified all of the carriers. Feel free to ask me questions in this so we can steer it the way you want to go. We notified all the carriers. I'm a fan of some agents, and I had somebody recently arguing with me on this, saying you do it after you close, which I totally disagree with.
Big mistake.
Yeah,
big mistake to do
yeah,
that.
that's right up there with smoking crack as a mistake. But post LOI, you black out the numbers on the LOI because it's none of their dang business what you're paying
That's
for
right.
it. And we reached out to every carrier and basically said, hey, we're under contract to buy this agency. Is this a good agency? Is their loss ratios good? Because in these hard market times, a lot of carriers are using acquisitions as an excuse to get off of a book. We didn't want to run any of that. Does this make sense for you? Are you guys cool with it? If they had 15 carriers, 13 of them we had contracts with. And in fact, there was one of those two that we didn't have a contract with that I didn't have a great relationship with from a prior job I was at. And even they extended the appointment. So we were able to get all the appointments extended, which was good. Every one of them, except one or two, had glowing reviews on the agency. In fact, one of the two that didn't was in the process of pulling their contract and non-renewing the book, which put me in an awkward spot because they told me not to tell the seller. And I'm like, now I'm in the middle of this, but we negotiated with them and they agreed to keep the contract, keep the business on the books if we took it over, which is really good. The agency that we purchased had no management system. They were running the whole agency off an Excel spreadsheet. Not good, but we knew the challenge of that, and that, in my opinion, was factored into the purchase price a little bit. So
it absolutely was, yeah.
Yeah, so we got access to that spreadsheet immediately, and started digging into the data and making sure everything, essentially when we reached out to the carriers, we're like, hey, can you send us a report on this book of business to verify that the numbers were right? In our case, they weren't right, but with most of the carriers, they actually had more business on the books than what was on the spreadsheet. So that was good.
So I
Sorry.
think, Bradley, that's a huge thing for people to hear, though. Like, what the information you get at the time to do an LOI is not the information you use in order to seal the contract. So
Yeah.
lots of things can happen: lost business, new written business, all kinds. You can lose carriers, you can lose producers, you can hire people. Like, things move and shift. This is a
Mm-hmm.
living, breathing
Yep.
agency, so you've got to go back and actually verify what you think you're buying is actually there. And we
Correct.
found discrepancies,
We
no
did.
question around that,
We
right?
did.
Yeah.
Most of them were
So,
to our favor,
yep.
in terms of the financial impact. Now, there was obviously some stuff we found that, and you're going to find anything in any agency. But one of my favorite things to do, and I do this before the LOI and after, is dig into the P&Ls and say, okay, what are the expenses and which of these expenses am I going to keep? My favorite thing to do is to eliminate expenses and then consolidate some. Like, for example, they have a phone system. We already have a phone system, so we don't need their phone system. We've nailed down our. If you have an agency with employees, you have a cost. It's costing, aside from salary, it's costing you something to have that employee sitting at that desk. And our cost is about $550 a month. That's AMS, CRM, phone system, health insurance, etc. Right? So you have to factor that in there. You can't say, hey, I'm going to eliminate all these expenses. Oh, I just eliminated $500. But if you have 3 employees, you gotta subtract $1,500 to that. So I love going through that. My goal when I go through one is I figure out whatever the payment's going to be for the agency if I finance, and I want the expenses I eliminate to cover that payment. That's like to me like the best case scenario, and figure out okay what's going to be our working EBITDA. And I'm just pulling all this off the top of my head, but then you get into like employees. The difference between buying an agency without employees and buying an agency with employees is the difference from like Pee Wee football to the NFL. Totally different deal, way more headache. You got people, all that kind of stuff. So in this case, we got salaries from the employees. We got copies of their contract, which was hilariously written. And they had these employees had some book ownership in their books. If you're listening to this, do not do that. The only people that win when you do that are attorneys. So
Wait, I got to repeat that. Do not give a producer ownership in their book. If you want them to have ownership, you should give them minority ownership in the agency
or ghost equity or something.
Anything. Deferred
and
comp.
there's a million ways to do it that accomplishes the same thing without giving book ownership.
Yeah.
And
so Bradley, talk about what had to happen before you could close with the partially owned producer books. Tell me.
Yeah. So the first thing that happened is the salaries that he sent me were not actually the salaries. And it was very hard for us to verify that because he was paying them by paper check. No payroll company, nothing like, no, it gets worse. There's stuff I'm omitting too. But we didn't find out that they weren't getting paid what he told me they were getting paid until I met with them to tell them we were buying the agency. And they're like, that's not how much I get paid.
Was he saying more or less? I hope
less. He was saying less. Yeah. So that complicated the deal in that so this agency had 9 employees. Now there were 2 that we were not going to need. There was like a bookkeeper and a data entry person. We already had that. So they were told, well, I'll get that in a minute. But so those 2, and then that left us with 7. And we realized, wait a minute, this deal only works with like 5 people. So we went into it knowing, hey, 4 of these people we're going to have to cut loose. And you want the seller to do that before you take over. You don't want the burden of doing that. Also messes up your numbers in terms of financing, all that sort of stuff. Makes you look like a mercenary after you take over and all that jazz. But they also, and I'm thinking this is what you wanted me to talk about, they also didn't have like non-competes, non-solicits. So the way that we handled it was about 2 weeks before we sold, he met with, or 2 weeks before we closed, he met with them. It was November, so it may have been more than 2 weeks. It was right after Thanksgiving. He met with them and told them he was selling the agency. I gave him some talking points to really talk me up. He had a copy of the magazine with me on the cover. Some of them had actually heard me speak at a Big I convention, which helped. And for all accounts, he did a good job with that. And then the conversation, and I was not present for this. The conversation was, hey, as a part of this deal, I need you to sign this non-solicit agreement. Not a non-compete, not going to prevent anybody from working anywhere else, non-solicit. And I had my attorney draw it up for him. Actually, I had ChatGPT write it, and then I had my attorney sign off on it. But and it was transferable in that deal.
But not only that, they would their portion of
their
the
buyout
books would be
yes.
Yeah,
so part of their deal, part of the deal is they were going to get a buyout of their ownership portion in the book from his funds that he received. So we kind of got saved. So the purpose of asking them to sign that non-solicit is if somebody refuses to sign it, you got a fox in the hen house and you let them go that day. Thankfully, that did not happen. Everybody signed it without a problem. So our hurdle was, and this is something that I didn't think about, and I think some people didn't think about, if I'm buying a book of business, I'm buying the renewals. That's what I'm buying. Okay, you're buying the renewal rights. If I've got a producer in that agency that's getting an aggressive renewal rate, that kind of screws the deal up. And that was what we realized. And in the fact of like the payroll being paper checks and it's really hard to track like who made what, um, made it a little harder for us to catch that. But then I'm like, wait a minute, these people are getting paid like in some cases like 50% renewals. Now, granted, their actual books weren't, the bulk of the business was stuff he had written, the owner had written, or prior employees had written, but it kind of screwed the deal up. So we were sort of saved, and I don't know if Carey, if you and I have ever talked about this, we were sort of saved by the book ownership thing because I was able to have a conversation with him and say, hey, look, you're not going to get paid renewals on the stuff you wrote before anymore, but that's what your buyout's for. And nobody wanted to give up that lump sum. And I didn't offer it, but I kind of implied it. So it sort of gave us a little bit of a vacuum where we could like separate those two and say, hey, everything you wrote before, you're not getting paid renewals on.
Well, I think people listening to this need to, everybody wants to go online and say, what should I pay for a book of business based on the revenue? And then they might go and say based on the carrier makeup, and they might go a little bit deeper, but you got to go super deep because you could pay the right amount based on the revenue, based on the carrier makeup, based on the loss ratio, based on the growth, all of that, and then acquire some people in a comp structure that will never ever cash flow because you can't pay them the same way. And if you change their comp, like, listen, if you're the new buyer and you're changing a whole bunch of stuff and you change their comp,
It ain't gonna go well. Yeah, the funniest thing is like when people are like in like IAOA or insurance soup, they're like, how much for a $2 million premium agency? And somebody's like, oh, 4 times or 3 times or 2 times. And I'm like, you don't know until you get in there. Like I just told the story of one that you and I looked at. It was a multi-million-dollar revenue agency that only wanted 2 times revenue, but the deal didn't work. I know of another one that somebody else bought, and he called me for advice, and it was a $2 million premium agency, so 200K in revenue. And I asked him what the EBITDA was, and he said it was 150,000. And I was like, "Oh, you mean revenue?" He's like, "No, that's what their EBITDA is." This agency was spending zero money on anything. They literally had a $500 a month office and like a phone system. So like obviously that one is worth way more. That you know, so it just depends on what you get when you get in there. But my biggest regret, so we knew we were going to keep 5 employees. There were 7. We had kind of an idea of one of them probably wasn't going to work out. We essentially what we did, unfortunately, there just wasn't a better way to do it. So we had a Christmas party. We invited them to our Christmas party. That way we could kind of get a feel. And then we took each employee to lunch and kind of decided on 4. And then there was 2 that were interchangeable. Thankfully, one of those 2 self-selected out. And it was one of the ones with like a big question mark. The other person did some really egregious stuff like 2 months into it, and we had to let her go as well. So we lost both of them. So we were right about both because there was question marks. And the big regret I have is not telling the employees sooner. I wish we told them like a month out. I wish we'd have told them 60 days out because I was not prepared for the level of questions that would come from them. I was not prepared for because we were giving all of them a raise. I'm a big fan of giving employees raises when you buy an agency. It leaves a good taste in their mouth. I was not prepared for the level of negotiation on some of those raises that we went into. And I don't blame them for doing that at all. So I wish we'd have done that a little sooner. To be completely honest with you, I had extreme anxiety about it. Like the day that I went there, to meet them for the first time, which was the same day he told them, was probably like the most nervous I've ever been in my life. Um, and I remember going to a Bible study at my church that night, just extremely exhausted, just from extroverting all day. Because I basically that day did like 7 interviews in one sitting. Um, and So, yeah, I wish we'd have told him a little sooner. And then we had one. This is kind of where it was almost like, if you remember, Carrie, it was going too well, the due diligence was. And every deal has some kind of contention in it. I don't know if that's a word, but it's contentious to some degree. And we had the employee that self-selected out was the top producer. Um, would not be considered a top producer at Portal, but based on the numbers there, was a top producer. So my fear was her going somewhere else, these accounts leaving. So we negotiated I said, hey, we're going to withhold a certain percentage from the purchase price, which was less than 10% for 6 months. If their retention is less than X, we're going to keep that. Initially, the seller agreed to it, no problem. And then, like the day before closing, got really upset about it. I was on a family vacation, going back and forth via email. It got pretty gnarly. And I'm like, look, if you would have just told me that you had a problem with it 2 weeks ago when I asked you about this, I would have said, all right, well, we'll figure it out. And so what we ended up settling on was, instead of me holding the money, he would hold the money, which is totally weird, but it was basically me waving the white flag just to get the deal through. And literally like 10 minutes before we closed, I didn't know.
Yeah, it's a stress. It's super stressful. It really is. But, you know, I think that the biggest thing you just said was something will be wrong. It's either in the beginning, it's either in the process of when you're getting the agreement in place, or it's post. Like, there is no perfect deal, there is no perfect offer, there is no perfect due diligence, there is no perfect anything, because it's people, and it's a living, breathing thing. And I think the other thing I would say, Bradley, is the reason you were so stressed driving to them is it's people. Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
hard to
Right.
mess with people's lives,
And
like
you want
it's
to do right. You want to do right by them
yes.
and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, it's if this doesn't work for you, you go bankrupt. If it doesn't work for them, they go get another job. So it's your butt that's really on the line. And I know it sucks and that sort of thing, but you try to make it look and feel and sound like, hey, you're getting a step up by joining this other group. Um, and and the it's tough, um, to say the least. But yeah, that's my biggest regret, is just not talking to them sooner and getting them a little bit more involved in the process. The other thing is we were originally going to close the office. If you remember that, I wasn't going to keep the office open, and a combination of two things made us keep that open. One is the rent at the office was super cheap. It's in a beach town on the main road. Like, literally everybody tells me they see our office, and the rent's only like $1,100 a month. But then also, the 5 that we kept had, all but 2 of them had been in insurance less than a year. And so for training purposes, it was easier for us to go down there and train everybody at once, rather than try to do it through Zoom or one by one or that sort of thing. So, so we ended up doing that as well.
So you talked about, we knew that some of the staff wouldn't stay. There are some people that when they do an acquisition, they say, we're not going to change anything for 12 months.
Yeah.
We're going to leave it all exactly the same. That was not your plan, correct? That was, so tell me, how was your plan, and how did it actually go? Other than the people, if you want to comment on some of those things, because
Yeah. Yeah. So I went and met with him one day, for a full day, where he took me through their processes. And even though they had no technology, their process as it related to the customer was very similar to ours. So the messaging to the employees was, hey, nothing's really gonna change in terms of the process. It's just more technology. Uh, they have called me a liar on more than one occasion about that, but I always let them know, like, hey, I didn't realize how screwed up it was. Like, I was working with the inform, and I swear he listened to a podcast or something and just regurgitated my processes to him. Because after we got in there, we realized, like, wait a minute, this is not what I was told. So that was the biggest thing in terms of just the actual process with the clients. It was just completely different than what we were told, and we do things way different than what they do. So that unfortunately caused a lot of stress on the employees, which I didn't know. If I'd have known that, I would have said, hey, a lot of crap's going to change. Um, uh, but I knew it was going to be difficult. I wasn't, I thought it was going to be like a level 6 difficult. It's more like a level 9. But other than those two things, I mean, for the most part, it's gone according to plan. I mean, it's cash flowing, not quite as good as we thought, but pretty dang good. We're gonna have a good year this year. So yeah.
It's been good. It's been really good. Yeah.
Yeah, and I couldn't have done it without Carrie. And one thing that was interesting, I'll give you a shout out. You did the financials on it for me, and you put together, I don't know what it's called, but this nice spreadsheet with all of our numbers combined. And when it came time to meet with the bank,
Yeah, actually, that's true. It's very true. So we did a combined pro forma where Portal Insurance was there, the agency he was acquiring was there. We did all the eliminations, and we explained why we eliminated certain expenses, why we added certain expenses, why we and the bank is looking for, will it cash flow? So the fact that we went and basically did a body of work that they would have done, allowed them to have some level of comfort to know that, hey, if I lend, this is what the cash flow could be, not necessarily what the offer should be, but this is what the expected cash flow is and what the assumptions are. And as long as they align with what the industry averages are, they're going to be far more likely to place that loan than they would.
and I didn't even talk. I didn't even talk during that meeting. I just like said, like, hey guys. But what's interesting is, like, something you may or may not know about me is I have like the highest functioning level of anxiety you've ever seen. And my wife, for example, is like very unemotional about money. Like, she'll write a large check. If it makes financial sense, she'll do it. I get really emotional about stuff. And I hate seeing the dollars leave my checking account. And I don't know if you remember this, Carrie. I got sort of wigged out towards the end because I have no debt other than my personal home. My car's paid for, no debt on the agency. And I'm a believer in debt if you're adding debt to add revenue, that sort of thing. And I remember calling you, and I remember being like, hey, look, I'm really like stressed out about this, if it's the right decision or not. I just need you to tell me, do I do this or not? And
Oh, I
that
remember
was
that.
I just like,
It's nice to have somebody else that is understands it to the level of, okay, if it were your money, would you
right.
make this kind of investment? Like, it's a different level of understanding, because nobody talks about the details of their deals with each other. Like, that doesn't happen, Bradley. So, but I get it. I don't like money leaving my bank account either. So you and I are cut from the same cloth when it comes to that. So
Yeah. Yeah,
Well, what's one
absolutely.
piece of advice when people come to you about acquisitions, what's one common piece of advice that you generally give to them, having a couple under your belt now?
Um, I'm trying to give you something different than don't fall in love with the deal, but I think that would be it. Is just don't fall in love with the deal, and at the same time, you have to have the empathy that this is this person's baby that you're buying, and sometimes that can get a little gnarly. And, I mean, I've been in conversations with people that tried to flex on me. Like I had one guy that was like bragging that his 20-year-old agency was $2 million in premium. And we had written $2 million in premium in the last 60 days. And I just let him be right.
Yeah.
Like now, this is not, if you're trying to convince someone to sell you their agency, it's not the time to, flex on people and try to one up. And that's, we'll just let them think they're right, which is probably good life advice too. I don't always follow it.
Is there anything that you wish when you reached out to people that they would have told you about acquisitions that they didn't, that you had to learn on your own? Because I know you reached out to a fair number of people. I mean, I shouldn't say a fair number of people, a close.
Yeah, not really. Not really. I mean, I had a conversation. We had an issue that popped up after the fact that I was stressed out about, and I called a friend of mine who is high up at a large agency, one of the ones that I mentioned earlier, and is over acquisitions. And he was like, we find those on every deal almost, like and but other than that, not really. I mean, I like to say that everything we've dealt with after the fact has not been unexpected, just maybe the level of it, but things are always harder. And I have to equate it to so I tell new employees here, if you don't work out and you start working out, you're going to be sore. Mm-hmm. But then after a while, you get conditioned to it, and all of a sudden you're not sore as much anymore. And, Portal's a high volume, we move fast, you're going to be dead tired the first 3 weeks. You just got to push through it. And I kind of look at this acquisition as that, the first one, even though it was profitable, was painful, but now we're better conditioned for the next one. When we come across something, we will have seen it before. There's no, that's how you gain confidence, is running into situations that you've dealt with before. Sure. I used to get really stressed out about public speaking. I've done it so much that I'm I've done this 1,000 times. It doesn't bother. You know what I mean? That's how you gain confidence. So
agreed. Well, Bradley, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. I think there's a lot of people out there that can benefit from the experience that you shared, and the things that people don't really talk about. There's always the headline of, hey, I bought something and it's all fantastic. But the reality is there's things that aren't necessarily fantastic. It's still an incredible deal. But I appreciate you being real about it and giving some people some things to think about as they move through their process. And it's just super nice to have you talking. I got to tell you, I listened to your podcast, and I think this is the most I've heard you speak on a podcast ever in my life.
Zach Gould told me one time, he said, sometimes I listen to your podcast just to see how long it takes for you to get to speak. But Scott's
I love Scott Howell. I love Scott Howell. Don't get me wrong.
Scott's the main host. He's the lead host. And he does a great job with that intro. And I don't mind being in the background. It does not bother me.
Well, there you go. With this one, we didn't want you in the background for sure. But thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Insurance Refocused podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to hit subscribe and leave us a review so you'll never miss us. Want to learn more about how Agency Focus can help you grow your agency? Head to agency-focus.com or email Carey directly at carey@agency-focus.com. If you need to get in touch with me, feel free to shoot me an email at lindsay@agency-focus.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.